Hello and welcome to episode 103 of GM Party. We are here with Jeff Stormer and Kate Bui. And, well, I'm not sure if I 100% pronounced that correctly.
No, that's right.
Beautiful. We're talking about randomization and world building, especially as pertains to tabletop RPGs. We'll start with introductions. I'll go first. I'm Andy Berdan. I do video game development professionally, and in the last couple of years, I've been branching into tabletop role-playing games. My original first true love, and a lot of the game types that appeal to me are story building heavy. Story games that involve a lot of player controlled creation. Kate, why don't you go next?
Sure. I'm Kate Bui. In the regular world, I work in software, but my love is storytelling and games. And I'm pretty active in the Seattle story games and narrative games community. And I co-coordinate the RPG workshop that we have here that helps designers like test and design new games. And I'm working on a couple games on my own, Kaiju Kiss, a kaiju dating game, and a bunch of like deeply introspective games about being sad. You can find me at Army of Meat on Twitter.
Great. Jeff?
Hey, I'm Jeff Stormer. I am a podcaster, a game designer, a million other things. I have a lot of hobbies and not a lot of free time. I'm the host of Party of One, which is an actual play about two-player role-playing games. Every week we sit down with guests one-on-one and play through a short self-contained RPG session. You can find that at partyofonepodcast.com. I'm also the host of All My Fantasy Children, which is a character creation, storytelling, and world-building tabletop podcast where every week we take a prompt submitted from a listener and we use some D&D tables, some various story games, different inspiration sources, and we spin them into a fantasy character. And you can find that at allmyfantasychildren.com.
That sounds particularly relevant.
It does.
So let's start with that topic then. So you mentioned having a user submitted prompt.
Mm-hmm.
Having a key prompt to launch off the world building really helps focusing that topic discussion.
Yeah. It is. It's always the kind of anchor that we go back to on the show. It is, we have to make sure that it gives us something that we can look back to if we don't know quite where we're going. And that's kind of, I think, the core of what made me really passionate about kind of the topic of like randomization was that idea that like taking a point of inspiration, whether it is a question or a listener prompt or a table result or something, and saying, okay, here's what I have, and building something out of that, which in its own way kind of felt like all of role-playing games in this kind of beautiful little cluster.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I think prompts are great for inspiring focused creativity. Often in a lot of games where there's a little bit too much freeform world building, people get analysis paralysis or they get kind of like stuck with too many potential options. They're like, well, what if the city's underwater or in the sky or giant dinosaurs or whatever?
That blank page problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Beautiful. One of the games I'm working on is about pitching a video game to the rest of the players. And in early prototypes, it was very much too much to choose from. Like there are so many concepts that you can deal with. Like how do you narrow that down? And giving the players the tools to narrow that down really helped focus the core concept of the game.
I'll go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it's always an interesting balance to strike between giving them enough scaffolding that they feel secure, but also giving them plenty of room to kind of ignore the scaffolding if necessary, because I know there are a lot of people out there that if you give them a large pick list of things to go from, they'll just sit there and try to analyze all of them, and then, you know, which one is the optimal choice. And so, you know, it's super delicate, and like I've struggled with that in some of my own games where it's like, do I give them a very limited set of world building possibilities but choose random things within that, or do I let them specify a larger set but then also like how do they interact with that reduced choice set without like overloading their brains?
Right.
Yeah, I had a similar experience to you, Andy, about the game that I'm working on right now. It's a game about like a super spy debriefing session after the fact. And the part of the way it works is everybody gets to submit their own little like idea of something that happened, and they write it on an index card, and nobody else gets to see it except them and the GM. And at first, it was just say something that happened. It can be anything at all, and that like the part of the game where players had to brainstorm that took 20 minutes. But once I kind of narrowed it down into like, you're going to give me a piece of information about this, and you're going to give me a piece of information about that. And I narrowed it into like more of a prompt of this is what I'm looking for, you know, go wild within these constraints. It quickly speeds up because then players can say, okay, cool, this is what I'm trying to go for. Oh, but what if it's this, this, and this? And then I get amazing creative ideas.
Right. The so how would you what are some techniques that you might think of that can mitigate that that thing that Kate mentioned, where a player might really dig into those tables and try and nitpick all the little details? Like, do you limit the choices that they can pick from the tables, or make them roll a die to choose from the table? Does anybody have any other ideas?
I just built a game kind of about that, where it's kind of a three blind men and an elephant type situation, where they have to describe an object using one of your senses, but nobody knows what the object is until everyone's done. And I have a big pick list, but in order to narrow that down, I use this sort of fiasco dice pool mechanic where it's like, okay, yeah, maybe there are like 36 options, but the dice say that you can only really pick from about 10 of them. So that's far less to worry about. And you only have to, like, once you narrow it down to a category, then you only have to worry about 5 or 6. So
I love rolling on dice. It's fun. It's fun to take a thing and to roll it, and like, and so I just love rolling on like random table results. It's just the most fun. And there's something about like there's a certain magic in rolling a dice, looking at a result, looking at a table and saying, "Okay, I have to use this. How do I use this?" Like that momentary, like there's that moment of paralysis of like, I don't know how to use this. But then there's that moment of like, oh, I get it. I see how it clicks together. That is one of my absolute favorite moments in game design, running games, writing things. It's just, I love it so much.
It's there's a certain balance, like giving people one thing to kind of roll with. That's great. That like launches them into things. But then if you give them more sort of points that you have to triangulate from, then they kind of get stuck. And so like too many random tables can be way worse than having no random tables.
For sure. And it can be a thing where like it's I've definitely been in situations where it's like, okay, I got to roll on all these things, and then at the end of it you're like, well, this is a mountain of data. This is a worksheet that I can look at. But like but it's my favorite thing is when you roll on a single table and it gives you a piece of information, and then you kind of get the option to look at other things and go, yeah, I don't need this. Or if I'm really stuck, I can go, okay, I'm going to keep the digging, or I'm good. And this is the thing that pushes me to be inspired and to make magic happen.
Right. So one of the things that I tend to like to do is I build options that dovetail in like orthogonal fashions. So you have elements that are completely independent. Then you have, by having simple lists, you don't have a whole lot of complexity, and you can limit those numbers of options. But when you combine that, then you get that combinatoric complexity. The issue that can happen there is that even though you have like 13,000 whatever combinations, um, people are like, oh, I already got this one axis. I already chose the evil axis, so I don't want to be evil again, even though it's the particular combination that is sort of the differentiating factor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think part of designing any sort of randomization system is just allowing for mulligans. You got to just let people be able to be like, no, let's do something else.
Sometimes you got to re-roll. Sometimes you just look at a result and you go, no, that doesn't work. There's actually it was a thing for a long, like, we on All My Fantasy Children, we made it a big thing where we were never going to re-roll. Like, we were like, no, they're going to roll with this. But then at some point, you just, a result comes up that just makes you go, this undermines everything else, every other result we've come up with. Like, this undermines the story in the game. So let's just not take this. Like, we're not beholden to the table result. And emphasizing that, I think, is really important.
At the end of the day, it's all about like whatever is most interesting for the players to engage with. And like if you're entertaining, if you're doing a performance, that's one thing. But like if you're just building a game, it's like some things that might be interesting kind of intellectually are not things that are particularly compelling for a certain player to play. So giving them the opportunity to kind of like swerve away from that. One of the things that I approached in another game that I made is I kind of stole the idea from Carolyn Hobbs's Downfall, where I built a pool of traits for the world that you can then pick and choose from, like which ones that the group as a whole is interested in, even though they're all present. You can choose to accentuate certain ones or de-emphasize others that you find less compelling. So you can add randomization, but also still leave a certain amount of like user control over the narrative.
And I think there's a safety aspect there as well, right? Like, there's just some things that will make people uncomfortable, and then having having that emphasis and freedom to say, like, you are in no way beholden to this. It's your story more than the game story is, I think, really valuable.
Absolutely. So would you build in mechanics that have that, or would you approach that simply in terms of safety tools, X card, and those kinds of various tools? Go ahead.
I think it's a combination of the both, right? Like, you need to set the player's expectations at the beginning with regards to safety, but also like building in the mechanics that allow you to choose the story that's most interesting for your players to explore is important, because like nobody wants to get stuck with just like, oh, well, okay, I guess I'm playing a bugbear bard or something. I don't know or want to do that, but that's fine. But one thing that I actually want to posit this as a maybe an idea to float out there. Randomization for each individual player may be not necessarily related to a truly random dice. Like, by having other players suggest elements, those are things that you as a player would not come up with yourself, but then you have to weave them in. So like, you don't actually need a random number generator in order to have a random experience as a player or a world builder.
That's interesting. A lot of my game designs are improv inspired, especially considering like one of my early sort of design inspirations was Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which is
Great game.
basically like you throw wrenches at other people's stories and you roll with it. And you're totally right. It does feel like a totally random thing, but there are 0 dice in the game.
And I would posit that actually for the other players at the table, that's a little bit more of a satisfying end when someone takes something that you threw out and then weaves it with their own thing, and then it becomes a space that you both can play in that is unexpected and new.
Absolutely.
It reminds me a lot of like the leading questions in Dungeon World, right? The idea that like I'm going to ask you a question and it's going to have a little bit of what I want of the world in it. I'm going to throw it out to you. You're going to respond, and together we have sort of built this thing that is better than the sum of its parts, right? And that's sort of I agree. It is a beautiful experience that like it makes it so that no one person takes ownership of a thing. It is really everyone's thing.
Absolutely. That reminds me of my next game. My I guess second quarter title is basically designed around a rock band, well, musical band. But they're supposed to be terrible people, and in a band that only barely works together. So a lot of the questions are definitely leading questions that are designed to build dysfunctional, broken relationships within the band. Because that's the story I want to tell. I want to build out Spinal Tap and have the experience of the actors performing in the movie Spinal Tap. I want the players to have that experience. So those leading questions, I never thought of them as randomization. I always thought like, well, Mic Drop doesn't have any kind of randomization. It's all on the players. That's an interesting thought. I'm going to have to think about that some more.
So I regularly play with Narrative Games Northwest up here in Seattle, and it's, we always play like one-shot GM-less games for the most part, and it's a rotating cast of people with all different perspectives and like all different play styles, and so you never know what you're going to get. So it's basically random. Even if you're playing exactly the same game of Fiasco with the same play set, with the similar dice rolls, like everyone is going to approach it and bring their own weird things to the table that like will drastically shift the narrative. And so that's the perspective that I come from, where like your players are a much better source of that that like wildness, where like dice are fun, and it definitely gives you inspiration when you like have to, let's say, describe something that hasn't been done before, or that other players have no input on. But like getting in there and like bouncing off of one another is super compelling.
And it's like when you really look at it like that, it's like that's role playing as a whole, right? It's that we're all gonna bring a thing, we're all gonna bring one piece of the puzzle, and we don't know what the other pieces are, and that's gonna come together into something much cooler. And that's really like role playing games is the thing.
Yeah, they're rad.
Yeah, well, it's really that old statement, right? The product is greater than the sum of its parts. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And it really is. It's like everybody can bring their own thing, and then that gestalt that happens is just, well, the hobby, really.
Yeah,
it's magic, and it's so I guess I'm going to back now, having put all that out, I'm going to back it down a little bit and say that randomization in terms of like dice and tables and stuff is actually great training wheels for players that are not either super comfortable with improvising whole cloth, or who just don't have the vocabulary or like mental structures that let them do that yet. And like, as they build experience and skill in the art and craft of role playing, the scaffolding becomes less and less necessary. But I think it's a super great way of getting like new players in. Like, again, Fiasco is really good at like setting up a scenario and weird characters and all this fun stuff through randomization that like may be really difficult for Joe Random off the street to come in and start playing.
Right. And the Fiasco uses essentially D66 tables to set up all their scenarios. I prefer card-based options. Now, I've approximated card-based stuff by using playing cards and look up tables for, Jack of Hearts is this, and I just spent time today to mark up all the playing cards for a specific game, so that I don't have to look it up on tables. I don't know what you've worked with, but what methods of the guiding tools for players, what methods have you found to be most convenient?
I'm a big fan. I really like going back to like talking about questions. I think like if you're going, there was a LARP I wrote that was card based. You pulled a card, and on that card it had five or so questions, and those questions kind of guided you to the place that I wanted you to be at, but let you fill in the details. I think the idea of like pulling, not necessarily a concrete like this is what is going to happen, but pulling a random thing that says like, tell me about this. What is this detail? It goes back to what you were saying, Kate, about like the idea of it being kind of a training wheels, or a way to push you into this way of thinking. Is if you look at it, is if you randomly draw something that asks you a question, it says like, okay, now you're going to bring in this detail that you're passionate about. I'm going to guide you a little bit of the way. I'm going to push you. I'm going to take you to the edge of the pool. You're going to dive in. And it like, I'm a big fan of something that pushes you to have to think, okay, how do I answer this? What do I take from me that like brings something to the table along these lines?
Yeah, my sort of go-to like gateway drug to role playing for new people that I try to introduce to the hobby is Avery Alder's The Quiet Year, because it is that combination of like, here are cards, you draw a card, you look it up in the table, and it gives you very specific prompts, and you answer this question, and you don't need to go into super depth if you don't want to. Just give me the answer to this question and you will have built part of this world. And I think that is a super great mechanic. I also love the dice and cards have a totally different sort of arc to the play, where like dice are like, the probabilities are always going to be the same, but like with cards, as you draw that stack lower and lower, the probability curve shifts until you get to like the sort of eventual inevitable conclusion of these are the only cards left. And that becomes this like great forcing function to get you to really interesting prompts.
Absolutely. Yeah, they with perfect pitch, like I said about the orthogonal stuff earlier, I've essentially divided the deck into the 4 suits. Each of the 4 suits is a different portion of the game pitch that you have to describe. So, for instance, you could have a what's the sample prompt? I'm trying to remember the sample prompt. An obnoxiously cute dating game about magical architects. And those are the four orthogonal aspects. And building out those four suits, you have very specifically those four suits as separate decks. So it's a very controlled replacement. However, there's a fifth deck, which is the answers. And the other players are tasked with asking you questions about the game. And the answers you give back to them have to be in these forms. And there are 8 of those. And you go through all of them. So it's a very known progression. You know what kind of answers you're going to have to give, but you don't know when or to what question it's associated. So all of the variations come out. So to some degree, the randomization is there in terms of ordering, but not so much there in terms of content.
That's a really interesting sort of look at things, because like the order of play actually can really change up the way that you look at a specific situation or problem. And so, like, you know, let's say that you have to fight a dragon, right? Like, if you have to describe the dragon first, and like describe the dragon's claws and breath weapons and whatever, before you ever formulate your solution for fighting that dragon, that would give you a much different style of play than if you did it the other way around, right? If you say, okay, well, I know there's a dragon there, I'm gonna throw a fireball at it. Well, it's a frost dragon, but that's okay, that's cool. I really like that idea of like randomizing the order in which you engage your gameplay loop, because yeah, that's neat.
That's something that we've been doing, or I've been working on with Mission Accomplished, which is the spy game debriefing game that I've been working on. Originally it was very straightforward in terms of, here's the scenario, now you're going to make characters, now we're going to figure out, like, play through the scenario. Or it's like, here's your characters, here's the scenario, we play through it. But I started really thinking about it in terms of playing a game out of order. Like, it was...
Did you run this? Did you run a playtest of this in the One Shot RPG Discord at one point?
Somebody else ran it for me, but yes.
Yes, I played this.
Good. You played the earliest version of it, which has changed dramatically, but you have a core idea. So the premise has become, you start out by asking a bunch of leading questions about, like, tell me about the mission. What blew up during the mission? Like, what's the thing that exploded? Tell me about the villain's lair. And you have all these things. Then once we have that, we have to figure out how the players are. And then once we have all of this information, then we start handing out index cards and saying, okay, now tell me what this person did and tell me what that person did. And it changes the way you think about it, because it's no longer, well, I am the best person for this job. It's, well, I definitely wasn't the person that caused that explosion, so how do I make my character into the person that didn't blow this thing up? And it changes it. You're absolutely right. It changes the way that you think about it. Just instead of saying, we're going to start here, it's we're going to start here and work our way back.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like similar to Microscope, where you can take, you've got that beginning era and that ending era, and then it's like, well, there's a big question mark in the middle. Let's figure out where we want our story to be.
Yeah, sketching those, like it feels so much more empowering to go backwards and be like, I'm going to retcon everything. I'm going to say that the reason that, like, they won this war was because they were all ghosts. And like, instead of having it be a sort of like declarative thing from the beginning, it then becomes this way of like reframing everything that like just feels way more satisfying for some reason.
Yeah, because you get, it's like solving a puzzle, right? You have all these pieces that don't make any sense, and then all of a sudden you find this story that everything just drops right into place, and then you have this crazy mosaic that looks like a dragon.
I think of it almost like editing a movie. It's like, you know, you film things in a certain order, and then there's that moment where you can look at it and say, oh, this is how it's gonna like fit together. And it gives you the opportunity to look back and say, oh, this was a major undercurring theme. Let's just go back and make this the thing that the story is about. And like, I absolutely love like when you have that moment of realization and you can go back and say, oh yeah, X, Y, and Z happened because this is a story about hubris, or this is a love story. So of course these things happened in this order. That's what happens in a love story, and it's such a good, satisfying moment.
Absolutely, yeah. I've done some filmmaking stuff, and for me, when I do short film production, always build out that storyboard. That's nice linear process, like A follows B follows C. And then when you get to production and shooting, it's like this chaotic mess that's defined by time and locations and people's availability and where the sun is in the sky and like all this mess. And then you have like this pile of crap that you have to assemble into something that moderately resembles what you have in the storyboard. And sometimes it ends up being what's in the storyboard. Sometimes you find a different story in the footage. And that finding that different story in the footage, I think, is what kind of the experience you're describing is. That's kind of what role-playing games are. It's like you have these pieces. That's your footage. And you're building something that isn't what you set out to build usually.
I think that's a great metaphor, because like if you treat collaborative sort of like randomized world building as an editing process, it becomes a lot clearer what is possible and what like should be allowed. Like you shouldn't have to bring in every single second of footage you filmed, right? Like there's a lot of it that's just not good or not good for the story that you're telling. So like being able to pick and choose these elements, reorder them, recontextualize them, be like, okay, well, we have a story about like sailing ships, but maybe they are like dream sailing ships or spaceships or whatever else that would better fit our story. That like process of figuring out where those cuts are, that what is it, the Kuleshov effect, the like juxtaposition that creates meaning, I think is a really interesting way of looking at this world building process.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like that.
It reminds me, because all things remind me. I'm gonna go down a tangent, and everybody's just gonna have to follow me down this road for just a minute, and then we can talk about other things. But we're gonna talk about wrestling right now because we're gonna talk about professional wrestling. Wrestling is a LARP, and this reminds me of like how it is. Like it's the thing of like we know where we're going, right? You know how the match is booked. You know the ending to the match. It's not, but it's about how we get there, and it's about how you take the audience reaction and how you take the fact that your ankle has been hurting because you landed wrong last week. And you take it and you go in these three directions and you tell this story and you find the details along the way. You respond to the prompts that are given to you by the audience. If they start booing that guy, maybe that guy's got to start cheating. You don't know. But like it is this perfect thing of like, we don't know how we're going to get there. We know what the ending is. How we get there and what the story becomes could take a million forms. All we have is that ending. Let's figure it out along the way.
I 100% agree with that. Like wrestling is such a undervalued storytelling medium that like, Barth, like he wrote extensively about wrestling and how it is this beautiful play of morality that like that I think a lot of role players could learn from. if they weren't like wrestling.
I thoroughly agree. It is a thing that we should all be watching more of, and I watch a lot of it already. It's a thing that we should be watching more of, but there's only so many hours in a day.
But like that actually kind of brings up another question I had, was that with wrestling, right? Like they structure it to have a very specific sort of arc that guarantees a sort of satisfying ending. Whereas like one of the dangers of randomized world building and randomized sort of narrative creation in general is that like sometimes you will not get a satisfying narrative arc unless you're basically like going all out to try to bend the characters and the story to fit something that will be satisfying. So like I guess how do you deal with those situations where you're like, this feels like a dud. I don't know if I can take it to it's like to stick the landing.
What it makes me think of the way Fiasco handles it is that it has that 2-act structure where you have the early game, which sort of sets up the scenarios and the relationships and the locations and builds them out a little bit, so you have this cohesive world. And then there's the twist that like screws everything up. In terms of like your standard sort of 3-act narrative structure, you've got your characters, then the twist happens, and then you put your characters in a tree and you chuck rocks at them, and then you're done and you do the epilogue. The epilogue in Fiasco is fairly minimal, but you kind of that's your arc. It works for Fiasco in terms of the structure it has, because things, when you start a game of Fiasco, like it's in the name, it's going to be a disaster. It's not going to work out well for like anyone. But in terms of something else, like in my game Perfect Pitch, it doesn't always end up in a satisfying arc, but generally speaking, you end up with this idea for a game. I work with video game developers, and I've tested the game a lot with them because they're around. And half the time, I play the game and like, okay, we should just make this game now. And I don't know, that feels like a satisfying conclusion, at least, but it's not so much an arc. It's just ending on a high note.
There's a game called The Ward by Kevin Petker. It's a Powered by the Apocalypse game about medical drama, that one of the agendas in it is like share is something to the effect of like have secrets and share them openly. The idea that like, and I think that is something that I've taken into a lot of other games along that note, is like, if I want a particular like big climactic reveal or something to really like wrap up a narrative, I think there's an underrated power in just saying, I really like halfway through a game and saying like, okay, look, I need this comeuppance to come by the end of the game. Like my character has been lying and stealing from people this whole time. I need something to happen that gets me in trouble by the end of it. And I think there's a beauty. It's kind of that retroactive finding the theme after, is like when you find it, when you sort of hit on that moment where you go, oh, I think this is what's happening. Saying it out loud and being, okay, now let's make sure that this happens, and like let's put the ending in place so that we can start working towards it, because I think this might be what the story's about.
It's like I can picture in my head the characters are setting up dominoes, but in random places on the table. And then eventually, once you have enough of the story in place, all the dominoes are connected, and then it all falls down. But it's not this nice little line of dominoes. It's like one here, one here, one here. And then everybody fills in all that holes. I think visually, as you think. I feel like that I may use that. Setting up those sort of scenarios that by the end of the game resolve.
I think there does need to be some sort of strong driving need for the characters in order to get them to a place. And even if the world is, random and changing at every act, like their core motivations still need to be the same. So perhaps, as part of the sort of like world building aspect of things, like making sure that their core motivations still make sense in the context of the world, or finding those motivations after the world building is done. I'm not entirely sure which is the preferable, and maybe it depends very much on the game itself.
Yeah, yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Jeff? Building motivations into the world building versus after?
I think that my view of motivations, my big picture view of the world in games is always that like it only goes as far as the characters, and so I think you're exactly right, and I agree that I think it's valuable to say like we can say whatever we want about the world, but if it does not come back to what these characters want, then we're just filling in a wiki page. Like it always has to come back to, well, my character is greedy, so I have to be thinking of this world in terms of things I want, and I have to be thinking of that in terms of like what I want that I can't have. And
Right.
so for me, that in itself is sort of an inspiration point for world building is, well, the characters are going to drive everything, and the world is going to be filled in one character at a time because it's our story, right? Like we're the people that we're telling the story about. I'm not terribly like I think it can be interesting and it can be a source of inspiration, but like I care about what my character is after, and I care about what these 4 or 5 people or one person or however many people are at the table. I care about these people's motivations and how the world reflects that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Uh, the fact that the characters are viewing the world through their own particular lens, and that we build the story of the group through these multiple lenses really does characterize how we build the world in a way
Yeah.
that's relevant to the character.
I kind of built that that I used that sort of process in a game that I built called the Underdogs, which is basically about like a little underdog sport team. But the playbooks are different archetypes. One is like the prodigy who's new to the sport and doesn't know anything about it. And like each archetype has different world building questions about the rival team from their perspective. So like the prodigy would know like about the person on the other team that like feels the least comfortable in the sport but like loves it the most, and what is that person like? Or the person that like is the klutzy person on the team might know the other person on the team that like isn't confident. And so using the lens of the character, you flesh out the world through that perspective. It's a fun process. People enjoy it a lot because it lets them focus in that character from their perspective and then kind of like paint the world with that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's great. Yeah, Jeff, do you have anything to add there?
I don't. I think that sounds awesome. I don't have anything to add to that.
Beautiful. I kind of want to steal the idea. But...
You're welcome to it. I am share and share alike.
Yes.
The better, the more ideas that get out there, the better our hobby.
Yeah, I don't have a place for it to go, but I really like the idea. Yeah, there's I had a point. I lost it. You're welcome.
character's perspective matters is what I think I've landed on what I want to add, and it's just that character's perspective matters. If the idea that there's no objective truth, there's just what we all perceive it. That for me is world building. It's as much we can say things are a certain way, but I'm way more interested in how this character perceives that thing being a certain way than I am saying objectively, well, this is this way. We accept this. It's okay, cool. What does my greedy character think about that? How does that relate back to them? That I think is really where great world building happens.
Well, that brings me to an interesting point. World building in terms of GM-less games, I guess, or GM-full games, is very different in world building where you have a GM role, where you have that omnipotent being, or at least theoretically omnipotent. So I don't know. As a GM, I never think of anything. I just make the players do it and go along with it, and make myself look smart. But how do you mitigate that distinction, especially in terms of the two-player podcast there, Jeff?
I think that's a really good question. And I think I think very similarly to the way you think, where like if I am GMing, I'm gonna it's that random source of inspiration, right? I'm gonna take what my players are giving me and I'm gonna roll with it, and it's gonna seem like I have done a bunch of things. Or maybe I'll roll a dice and look at a table and say, oh, this is an interesting result, or something like that. Like I'm gonna, it's for me the difference is between like where those ideas are coming from and who kind of takes ownership of it, which is partially why I think I've been floating towards GM-less games for a long time.
For me, I think it depends on if you have the luxury of having a setup session before actually embarking on a game. If you're playing a one-shot that's GM, then you kind of just have to roll with whatever's at the table. But if you're planning a campaign that you know is going to run like 3, 4, 6, 100 sessions, I think actually bringing in a sort of like cartography or anthropology game like Quiet Year or Microscope into the first session with the players, like to help them like get invested in the world, to establish those parts of reality. I think that's a perfect sort of hand in glove fit. Even if you are working in an established setting like D&D or something, there's still a lot of that map that the players can draw in, and giving them that opportunity at the beginning, and then like letting them fill in details as you play. I think that's a good sort of blend of the two styles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I've looked at the Microscope Explorer expansion, where they explicitly have a section about using Microscope as a world building adjunct to a campaign play. And I've tried it, and it didn't really work out well for me. Like it got the players invested, but then the game changed. Then the world changed significantly during the first session. So a lot of that work that was done in early world building using the other game seemed wasted.
I think it's less of a like you're not mapping the limits of the space. You're identifying the areas that the players are interested in. And so even if you end up building all these like NPCs and weird conflicts and stuff, you can kind of like distill it down to, oh, actually my players seem to be really interested in clones for some reason. So I'll just have more of that in my main campaign. It's a little deceitful, I guess, to be like, build all these things, but maybe we won't use them. But I will use my GM like abilities to distill everything down into what I believe you care about, and then I will give you that pure flavor of the thing that you want without the extra trappings of like the weird stuff that maybe your little brother decided to throw in.
Right. Yes.
And along those lines, like I am a big proponent. If I have a session 0, I am a big proponent of just sitting down and being like, what do we want to do? Like, what are the things or the themes or the things that, like, why this game, why this moment, why these players, like, what do you want? Like, and I'll be very upfront and be like, look, I'm GMing this game. Tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it. Like, and then I'll be upfront about like, and these are the beats that I want to hit. This is the story that I want to tell. What stories do you want to tell? And like, if somebody says like, oh, I want to have my character fall in love, I'm like, cool, I can do that. That's great. That's up my alley. If somebody's like, oh, I want to explore this part of the world, I can be like, well, then our game is set in this part of the world. Done. I will take your bits of inspiration and and like blend them together and come with something that hopefully delivers on all of those promises. I think there's a value in just saying, what do we want to do here? Like, what's the story that we're interested in telling, and checking in periodically and saying like, hey, we've been playing this for a while. Do we have a different story that we want to tell? Like, did we hit the beats that we want to hit? Where are we at now?
Often it's I find that some players have a difficult time articulating that up front until they actually get some sort of like investment in the world or characters, because they're like, I don't know, I guess I want to something with ninjas, probably, I guess, I don't know. But then if once you start describing, oh, like here's a ninja clan and here's the line of secession and like, oh, there's a demon pack, and they're like, oh, ninja demon packs, that's what I want. So like I find that playing to find out what the players are interested in is actually can be useful for certain types of players. Again, it comes down to comfort level and skill and like really knowing as a player like what your needs and desires are.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. The I tend to play with relatively new players. I test things out with people that are like, generally either new to story games or family whose approach to story games is me saying, I made this new thing. Here, try this out. You must, because you're related to me. So sometimes it works. But giving them that creation through play definitely works better for people who are at least a little invested, don't have the time to go through, say, source books or setting books. Maybe discovery as a player as well as a character can help that. So one of the things that we'd like to do with GM Party is we'll talk about issues that have come up with our recent products. And we've kind of been talking about things we've been working on as we've been going. So we can tie those back in or just call it an episode. It's fine. But if there are any particular issues, now that you have a podcaster and two game designers talking together right now, this is a good opportunity to say, hey, I got this thing that I need help with.
Sure, I'll launch in if Jeff, you're okay
Feel
with that.
free. Yeah.
So I'm working on Kaiju Kiss, which you know, I've pitched it as a kaiju dating RPG, but that means a lot of different things to a lot of people, and you know, some people see kaiju as like big fun fighty monsters, and like it'd be fun to like have them go on like cute dates, and it could be light and fun and nice. But then there's also another side of it that's like, hey, like there are a lot of weird issues that come up with regards to like consent between monsters that can't really talk to each other super well. And what does it mean to like be lovers in a world that everyone else is trying to kill you? And like it can dip into some heavy topics. So the problem that I've been having is like trying to find that right, like I actually think I might have to write two different games, and I don't want to do that. But I have to figure out like the audience I want to speak to and the themes that I want to explore with the mechanics that I'm writing, because like one of my core philosophies is that mechanics are the message, right? Mm-hmm. Like you have a very specific point of view with the way that you value certain things in your mechanics, and like how do I make sure that the values in my mechanics line up with the story that I actually want to explore? And so do you have any ideas on what happens when you want to tell two diametrically opposed stories?
So do you actually want to tell both of those forms of stories equally?
Or is it that's the problem, is that like I want to do both, but I think I don't know how to integrate them. Versus like actually maybe it's better to just separate these into two different experiences. So I don't know. Do you ever run into that sort of like, I have an idea, I could take these two different forks and they would be two vastly different games? What do you do when you hit that point?
I have a question for you, actually. Have you ever read any of the Paranoia games?
I haven't, no.
Because they actually touch on this exact thing, and I think that would be a valuable thing to look into. Okay. Because like the premise of Paranoia is, you are all troubleshooters, you're in a bunker, there's a giant computer giving you missions, but that computer is malfunctioning, and it's this huge dystopic society, and the rulebooks actually go into this because they're like, there are two very clear ways to play this game. There's like Zap Pow Bam, where you are wacky and you're getting orders that don't make sense and everybody's against each other. And then you can actually engage with the fact that this is a horrible nightmare dystopia scenario that like no one should want to be in, and like exploring the human misery that comes with that. And I know Paranoia XP, which is the one before the one that was on Kickstarter, was like up front was like, hey, there's two ways to do this. We're going to, as we explain things, we're going to highlight like this probably comes into play for this part of the game, but if you're trying it this way, and they're just very upfront about like, you could want one of two things from this, and I'm going to describe a scenario, and if you're looking at it this way, it's fun and it's cute and it's kissing, but if you're looking at it this way, it's tough and it's, negotiating consent. And I think there's value in saying like, hey, there's two sides of a coin here. Here's the scenario. Here's how it looks from one perspective. Here's how it looks to the other. Depending on what you're looking for, this is how it might look.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that, because that's exactly kind of the space I'm trying to navigate. I mean, like if you see the different ways people play Monster Hearts, that's kind of the problem I want to solve a little bit, because like some of those mechanics are a little intense for casual play, and vice versa. So like I want to make sure that things line up in the way that I want them to line up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I like the aspect of giving multiple options in the same rulebook rather than having two separate products. Calling out, it depends on how much mechanical change there is in the different aspects. I don't know if there will be a lot, but having different call out bubbles or something that are color coded for the different game types might be a nice, clear way of differentiating different aspects of the game. But especially if you can have a core set of mechanics and then have variations on mechanics as you progress into the different flavors. That's something I did with Perfect Pitch. Is I have a section of variant rules that vastly changed the way the game is played. It's this one goofy thing where you're all collaborating together on a game. Now it's competitive, and you're at each other's throats to make the best game and get the most funding. It's very like being able to capture those in one core set of mechanics, I think, is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And calling out those differences and variations, I think, is something that is acceptable to do as a designer.
Cool. Thanks.
I don't know if I would go to two separate products.
Yeah, I think that if you as the designer, if you as the authorial voice are upfront about like, hey, look, that you could read this two different ways, pick the one that you want to go with. Like, I think players will accept that and will run with that ball. If you're upfront about like, this could mean different things to different people, go in the direction you want to take it.
And I totally appreciated it in other products where they do that. And they say, I go into the game with a certain expectation, and then I read this, and it's like, you can interpret this the way that you have been interpreting it, or also this way, the way that somebody else might interpret it. They're like, oh yeah, wow, that's cool. I might do that sometime, and then play the game the different way. And it's all of a sudden there's like this added value of perspective.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody, for Kaiju Kiss, like, it's somebody who goes in and it's like, hey, it's a goofy rom-com Godzilla romp through a city, yay. And then read this and it's like, oh yeah, that's a thing. We're gonna do that sometime. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
So I have something that I've been fiddling with Mission Accomplished that I've been trying to tweak a dial, and I'm wondering if either of you have ideas on how to. And I know you kind of touched on something that kind of relates to this a little bit earlier. I have been trying to. Mission Accomplished is a semi-competitive role-playing game. It is a game in which players are competing because somebody is going to get a promotion by the end of this off meeting.
Right.
And somebody's probably going to get fired. Like, and so I've been trying to tweak with this idea of like getting players into a mindset, like striking a balance between having players there to have fun and tell a fun story and like laugh and be friendly, while also encouraging a certain level of cutthroatedness in play. Because I think that's for me is kind of the sweet spot of the game, is like I'm actively going to try and like sabotage your character, but I also don't want it to be a game that like I don't want it to be Uno, that is a game that is a scourge on families and households across this great nation. I'm wondering if you have ideas on how to get players positioned against each other in a way that does not feel like get characters against each other in a way that doesn't feel like the players are necessarily against each other.
Do you have a way in the game where you can trade a short-term advantage for a long-term gain? A short-term disadvantage for a long-term gain.
Not currently.
If you have something like that, then the interaction between those, you can also reverse a short-term advantage for a long-term disadvantage. You can have that one. That one's probably a little more fun for your case. So you can have players get an advantage in the story right now, but ultimately screw themselves in the long run. And it's like, I find that players are more motivated by immediate gratification. So if you have immediate advantage and immediate disadvantage, you can have that cutthroatedness by players sort of accidentally sabotaging themselves. And then you don't have necessarily that feeling, the sour grapes feeling of other players. It's like, Joe screwed me. Unless you, if that can be also, that's sort of also what you were talking about. You want that sort of competitive backstabbing going on. I don't know.
I kind of run into this in some of the games that I've had, not competitive per se, but like the sort of sour grapes feeling of like, my character's not really like being included in things, and that kind of sucks. And part of what I had to do was reframe the game as a story about the story and not the characters. Like, so instead of having the players be super invested in their characters' motivations, it's really about like being invested in like having this story of wacky hijinks, and like framing that at the beginning, saying that like, maybe don't have them be exactly their characters per se, but like have them have a like larger perspective, maybe from an organizational level, because like at some point it really is like you're there to tell a fun story. You're there to be able to kill your darlings, and like if you are too invested in your own character, you won't be able to tell the most interesting story because you won't want to kill your darling.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
that's a good point. It's like I was putting myself into the head of my own game for analogy, and it's about a video game. It's about making a video game when you're being competitive. So it's not so much about winning the bid for the video game. It's still about creating the most interesting video game, and the bid is kind of inconsequential. The competitiveness is secondary, but can be an element in the variation rules. But like you said, Kate, it's primarily about the thing you're creating together.
I think what Andy said earlier actually could be an interesting thing to pull in, this idea of like, hey, let's jazz up this story that we're telling together by I will give you a tool to screw my character over. And that will be fun for the both of us, because you get to play this thing and like really do something to me that like is real weird, but I gave it to you because like that is the story we're telling. That's the consent that I've given you to go buck wild.
I really like that, actually. That is something I'm going to have to like really chew on, is the idea of actively saying, I am offering up the tools of my undoing, and like having that I really like that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's great. All right. So I guess it's my turn to talk about problems. So yeah, I just took my game to a playtest, took Perfect Pitch to a playtest last week. And I ran through, and going through the playtest, I discovered that it's not so much a gymless RPG anymore. It's more of an improv party game. So the entire perspective of the game has taken a 180, and now I'm building this much more casual game. And the issue I have now is that I can do a DIY style game where you can easily build it out using playing cards. It's like all the hearts are this adjective, and all the diamonds are this noun, whatever, and have like this nice lookup table. Or the other option is to do custom cards, or have both as a here's the print and play version, make your own from playing cards, or just have a print and play version where you print up your own cards. I'm fairly set on it being card driven, but I'm not sure how far I want to go with that. Like, do I want to make it required for custom cards or not? Or like, if the print and play with playing cards is useful or not? I don't know. Opinions?
It's not a bad problem to have, honestly. Like the, I guess it depends on how much you want to invest in it. Like if you want to eventually go down the line of having it be sold in boxes in retail stores, then I think it definitely makes sense to go more the like printed play custom card type route. But if you just want this to be a light thing that people can carry a PDF and a pack of cards around and just play randomly at cons, with their friends whenever, then I think that's a perfectly good thing too. I guess, where do you see it?
I think keeping a small pack of cards, custom cards, would be my ideal. Yeah, so that if you could have like ordinary playing deck size cards, not even a double deck, just keep that around all the time. Like, I literally walk around with a playing deck all the time, even before I started working on this game. You never know when you need to play a game of euchre, right? But having that around with the rules and like a slip-in piece of paper would be my ideal. But whether or not somebody prints those rules up themselves and puts them in a playing card case, or I have a custom one, I don't know. I do like the aspect of not having to produce things myself. I guess even with custom cards, I could use drive-through cards, but it's nice to be able to just ship a PDF. It's simple.
I am a huge proponent of print and play. I basically like card games, board games, like anything that has a print and play, I go in on the print and play because I don't have a lot of space for board games, and I don't have a lot of, my space is at a premium, and I like being, knowing when I'm going to play a game, printing out that game when it's there, and then recycling it when it's done. That said, like I have anecdotal evidence, which we all know is the most accurate form of evidence. But I have a lot of friends who play a lot of improv party games, a lot of card-based party games, and I know that even the ones that go in on print and play will generally go for party games that will let them print and play like official looking cards onto paper that then they can paste onto that either they can just hand out the paper slips or like paste them onto index cards or something, right, rather than like having to write things on an existing deck of cards. So I think if you were going for, I would say go print and play is I would advise for print and play, whether or not you have a physical edition after that. Right. Because I think for a lot of people that's a very valid option. Mm-hmm. But I'd say like if you're even thinking about custom cards, I think it's worth looking into and saying like, what do I want this thing to look like? Because it card design, art direction, those things convey a lot to the player, and I think that's a valuable area to explore. I've said I think that's a valuable X like 7 times in this interview. I think I've said that phrase more in the last hour than I have maybe ever in my life.
Well, I think it's a valuable thing to say.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Jeff just said. I think print and play is a great like first step, and then like I think eventually the game that you described seems like it could be very accessible and fun for a lot of people that normally wouldn't play any sort of like story games or RPGs. Just having it for sale in like a bookstore or something would just be a very easy way for people to be able to access it. And like having a custom deck of cards is, that's easy, fun thing to pick up, put in a stocking, give to someone as a gift.
For sure. Absolutely. That's exactly how I feel. It's like, if a party game like that is an easy thing for me to take to my families for Christmas and just play, and we'll have a great Christmas. Do you want me to not have a great Christmas, Andy? Is that what this is?
I'll send you a version. Yeah, okay. Fair enough. I'm convinced. But is it so? I guess I was under the impression that print and play for cards was a little bit more effort than most people were willing to put in. But Jeff, you're saying that that's not really the case?
No, I have seen. I have a lot of friends who do a lot of print and play games, and they will absolutely go in and print out the cards and just have. I have a lot of friends who will just have big stacks of like printer paper card games that they're like, okay, cool, we're gonna play Super Fight or whatever, and they just deal out their little paper slips, and it's in like a Ziploc bag, and it's just a thing that they have, and they add expansions to it when print and play expansions come out. And
cool.
I have a lot, like, I don't think that's too much to ask of a player as well, especially if you then also have a physical option that says like, hey, if you don't want, you can do it this way, you can do it that way, it's up to you.
Cool. Well, I guess I'm going to have to do some tooling and make a layout generator for playing cards, because I don't do anything manual.
From a sort of like gameplay perspective, it's also less friction than having to go to a lookup table.
Totally.
So I think just from a player perspective, I think that's a better experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why I took a Sharpie and scribbled all over this deck so I could, to have like these kinds of nice prompts for that proper improv feel. Yeah. Okay. Cool. I think we're about wrapped up. Does anybody have any other topics that they would like to bring up?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty much a wrap.
Okay, let's just do a round table, and people can say where people can find their stuff. Start with Kate.
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Army of Meat. And then you can find my terrible blog where I'm doing all my games at kaijukiss.com. I will have more there, I swear. It's just a blogger page right now, but it'll be better, I swear.
Cool. Jeff?
Partyofonepodcast.com, allmyfantasychildren.com. You can find me on Twitter at partyofonepod. And yeah, that's it. I'll have some stuff about Mission Accomplished that you can find eventually.
Cool.
Follow me on Twitter, and I'll tweet out a link because I'm Twitter trash, and that's how you find. That's how I convey things to the world.
Yeah. I am also Twitter trash. You can find me at Andy Berdan. The show Twitter page is at Game Maker Party. The YouTube page is youtube.com/ just search for GM Party. That's the easiest way. And if you like the show, of course, check out patreon.com/GM Party. We have a page up there. It's fairly low activity, but it's up there. And my board gaming or tabletop gaming stuff is available at berdandy.com. My two names kind of squished together. Anyway, we'll call episode 103 a wrap. Thank you both.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.